The first thing you need to understand is that your brain is not designed to tell you the truth when everything is on the line. It is designed to keep you alive, and those two goals are not the same thing. The moment pressure enters the room, quietly at first, and then all at once, your brain begins changing the rules without asking for permission. It tightens its grip on the wheel. It narrows your vision. It starts whispering instructions that feel urgent and convincing. And it does all of this with the same confidence it uses when it's actually right. That's the danger. Under pressure, your thoughts don't sound panicked. They sound certain. They sound like logic. They sound like you. Picture the last time everything felt urgent. Maybe it was a decision that couldn't wait. A moment where silence felt like failure, where hesitation felt like weakness, where you could feel the weight of consequence pressing against your chest. Your heart sped up, your breathing shortened, and suddenly your internal world became very loud. Thoughts stacked on top of each other, emotions surged without explanation, and your mind began offering answers before you even finished asking the question. In those moments, we trust ourselves more than ever, because it feels like instinct has kicked in. It feels like clarity, but most of the time, it's not clarity at all. It's compression. Your brain is shrinking the world down to something it can control. Under pressure, your brain stops exploring and starts defending. It filters out nuance, ignores long-term consequences, and becomes obsessed with immediate relief. This is why people say things they don't mean, make decisions they later can't explain, and walk away from moments wondering who they were when it mattered most. The brain, sensing threat, reaches for the fastest available pattern, not the wisest one, not the most ethical one, just the fastest one that has ever worked before. It doesn't ask whether the pattern fits the situation, it only asks whether it ends the discomfort quickly. There's a quiet tragedy in that, because pressure is often where our most important moments live. Conversations that define relationships, decisions that redirect lives, opportunities that appear once and disappear just as fast. And in those moments, we hand the microphone to a part of ourselves that evolved to survive predators, not to navigate modern complexity. The brain under pressure is ancient. It remembers running, fighting, freezing. It does not remember reflection, patience, or context. It doesn't care about who you want to be tomorrow. It only cares about making it through the next 30 seconds without pain. Think about how many times you've replayed a moment in your head and said, "I don't know why I reacted like that." That sentence is more honest than it sounds. You didn't react like that. Your pressure brain did. The part of you that is calm, thoughtful, and capable was pushed to the background while a louder, faster system took control. And because it shares your voice, your memories, and your language, it's almost impossible to notice when the switch happens. That's why trusting your brain under pressure feels natural, and that's why it's so dangerous. Pressure hijacks perspective. It turns small setbacks into existential threats and minor criticism into personal attacks. A delayed response becomes rejection. A mistake becomes a verdict. A single moment feels like it defines everything. Your brain collapses time, convincing you that now is forever, and that whatever you do next will echo endlessly. In that state, rational trade-offs disappear. You're no longer weighing options. You're escaping discomfort. And escape decisions are rarely aligned with your values. They're aligned with fear. What makes this even more unsettling is that pressure doesn't announce itself with alarms. It sneaks in disguised as importance. It tells you this matters too much to slow down. It tells you hesitation will cost you. It frames urgency as intelligence and speed as strength. And because our culture rewards decisiveness and confidence, we rarely question the voice that says, "Act now." We applaud it. We call it leadership. We call it intuition. But intuition without calm is just reflex dressed up as wisdom. There's a moment, right before pressure takes full control, where the body knows what's coming. The jaw tightens, the shoulders rise, the breath becomes shallow. These are not just physical sensations. They are signals that the brain is shifting gears. It is closing doors, it is narrowing options, it is preparing to choose something, anything, that reduces tension. Most of us ignore these signals because we've been taught to push through them, to override them, to trust our mind and power forward. But pushing through pressure doesn't make you stronger. It makes you blind. The most unsettling truth is that some of your worst decisions probably felt right when you made them. They felt necessary. They felt justified. They felt inevitable. That's how pressure brain works. It wraps fear in logic and hands it to you like a conclusion you arrived at yourself. Only later, when the pressure is gone and your nervous system has settled, do you see the gaps, the exaggerations, the assumptions that went unchallenged. That's when regret shows up, not as a scream, but as a quiet, aching question. Why didn't I slow down? Slowing down under pressure feels counterintuitive because pressure convinces you that time is the enemy. But time is the only thing that returns your brain to balance. Even a few seconds of pause can be enough to let the louder systems step back and the quieter ones return. The problem is that pressure makes pause feel like risk. It frames stillness as danger. And so we move, we speak, we decide, all while the very tools we need for good judgment are offline. This is not a personal failure. It's biology. It's wiring. And understanding that is the beginning of something powerful. Because once you realize that your brain is unreliable under pressure, you stop treating every urgent thought as truth. You stop assuming that intensity equals importance. You start questioning the voice that demands immediate action. And in that questioning, a small amount of space opens up. Space to breathe, space to choose, space to become someone who doesn't disappear when things get hard. Pressure will always exist. You cannot remove it from life, but you can change your relationship to it. You can learn to recognize when your brain is shifting into survival mode. You can learn to distrust the certainty that shows up when stakes feel high. And most importantly, you can learn that the moments that feel like they demand instant answers are often the moments that deserve the most patience. There is a subtle shift that happens when you begin to notice pressure instead of obeying it. At first, it feels almost uncomfortable, like standing still in a fast-moving crowd. Your instincts scream that you're falling behind, that something terrible will happen if you don't act immediately. But if you stay there, just for a moment, you begin to hear a different voice beneath the noise. It's quieter, slower, and far less dramatic. It doesn't demand action, it asks questions. And that alone changes everything. The brain under pressure hates questions. Questions create delay, and delay feels like danger. That's why pressured thinking speaks in statements. This is wrong. This is urgent. This must be fixed now. There's no room for curiosity when the nervous system believes it's under threat. But the truth is that most modern pressure isn't life or death. It only feels that way because your body doesn't know the difference between a social threat and a physical one. Rejection, failure, embarrassment, uncertainty. Your brain processes them all using the same ancient circuitry. To your nervous system, a critical email can feel like a charging predator, so the brain reacts accordingly. Blood flow shifts away from the parts responsible for long-term planning and moral reasoning and towards systems built for speed. Your thinking becomes sharp, but shallow, efficient, but rigid. You stop seeing possibilities and start seeing exits. That's why under pressure we reach for extremes. Say yes or say no. Stay or leave. Fight or disappear. The middle ground vanishes, and with it goes wisdom. One of the cruelest tricks pressure plays is convincing you that your current emotional state is permanent. When anxiety spikes, the brain tells a story where it never comes down. When anger flares, it feels justified and endless. When fear takes over, it predicts disaster with absolute confidence. This is why decisions made under pressure often feel irreversible, even when they're not. The brain paints a future based on the present emotion and then demands action to avoid that imagined outcome. you're not responding to reality anymore. You're responding to a forecast written by stress. Think about how many arguments escalate not because of what's being said, but because of how quickly it's happening. One sentence lands wrong, the body tightens, the mind rushes to defend, and suddenly you're no longer listening. You're preparing a counterattack. Each word becomes ammunition. Each pause feels like surrender. In those moments, people aren't communicating. They're surviving each other. And afterward, when the dust settles, both sides often realize they were fighting ghosts. Assumptions, interpretations, fears that were never actually spoken aloud. Pressure doesn't just distort decisions, it distorts identity. It makes you forget who you are when you're calm. It convinces you that the version of yourself acting in haste is the real one, the honest one, the one who finally said what needed to be said. But honesty without awareness is not truth. It's leakage. It's emotion spilling out without direction. And while it may feel relieving in the moment, it often leaves damage behind that calm honesty never would. There's a reason why the advice to sleep on it exists in every culture, across generations. It's not superstition, it's neuroscience. Sleep resets the nervous system. It clears the emotional residue of pressure and allows the brain to integrate information more accurately. Decisions that feel impossible at night often feel obvious in the morning, not because the situation changed, but because the pressure did. Time didn't weaken your intuition. It restored it. But not all pressure allows for sleep or distance. Some moments demand response now, a conversation unfolding in real time, a crisis that won't pause, a choice that truly does have immediate consequences. In those moments, the goal isn't to eliminate pressure. It's to anchor yourself within it. That anchor is not confidence. Confidence can be just as reactive as fear. The anchor is awareness, the ability to notice what's happening inside you without immediately acting on it. Awareness sounds simple, but under pressure, it's radical. It means noticing the racing heart without assuming danger. It means recognizing the urge to speak without obeying it instantly. It means allowing a breath to fully leave your body before pulling the next one in. These are small acts, almost invisible from the outside, but they create just enough space for a different part of the brain to come back online, a part that can hold complexity, a part that can tolerate uncertainty, a part that remembers your values. Values disappear under pressure because they take time to consult. Fear is faster, ego is louder, habit is easier. But values are what you live with after the moment passes. They are what determine whether you respect the choice you made once the adrenaline fades. And regret rarely comes from choosing slowly. It comes from choosing blindly. There is an uncomfortable humility in admitting that you cannot trust your mind at its most intense. We like to believe that when things get serious, we rise to the occasion. That pressure reveals our true character, but more often it reveals our conditioning, our unexamined patterns, our oldest wounds. Pressure doesn't show you who you are at your best. It shows you where you're unhealed. That realization can sting. It can feel like weakness. But it's actually an invitation. Because once you know that pressure brain is unreliable, you stop taking its stories personally. You stop identifying with every urgent thought. You stop assuming that the loudest voice inside you deserves to lead. And in that shift, something steadier begins to emerge. Not perfect calm, not fearless clarity. Just enough distance to choose with intention instead of reflex. The most powerful people are not the ones who never feel pressure. They are the ones who don't let pressure decide for them. They have learned, often through painful experience, that the first impulse is rarely the wisest, that the urge to fix, defend, prove, or escape is usually about soothing the nervous system, not solving the problem. They have learned to pause not because they are indecisive, but because they are precise. And precision requires patience. It requires the courage to disappoint urgency, to let silence exist for a beat longer than feels comfortable, to say, "I need a moment," even when every part of you wants to rush. That moment is where choice lives. Not the loud, dramatic choice that feels heroic, but the quiet one that aligns with who you want to be when no one is watching. Pressure will tell you that you don't have time to think, that this is different, that this moment is too important to risk delay. But those are the moments that shape you the most. And the shape they leave behind depends on whether you acted from fear or from awareness. One creates damage you have to repair. The other creates trust you can build on. Learning not to trust your brain under pressure is not about doubting yourself. It's about respecting the limits of a system that was never designed for modern life. It's about recognizing that survival instincts are powerful tools, but terrible leaders. And when you stop handing them the steering wheel in moments of intensity, you don't become slower, you become clearer. The clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It grows over time, through repetition, through noticing patterns, through catching yourself mid-reaction and choosing differently. Each time you pause when you could have panicked, each time you listen when you could have lashed out, each time you wait when you could have rushed, you rewire something subtle but profound. You teach your nervous system that not every spike of emotion is an emergency. You teach your mind that it doesn't have to shout to be heard. Eventually, pressure loses some of its power, not because it disappears, but because you no longer confuse intensity with truth. You learn that calm is not the absence of urgency, but the presence of choice. And choice, once reclaimed, changes the trajectory of moments that once felt uncontrollable. When you begin to reclaim that choice, something unexpected happens. The world doesn't suddenly become easier, but it becomes quieter. Not on the outside. Life keeps throwing deadlines, conflicts, expectations, and uncertainty your way, but on the inside, the noise starts to separate itself from the signal. Pressure still arrives, but it no longer crashes through you like a wave. It knocks. And that difference changes how you move through everything. You start to notice how often urgency is manufactured rather than real. How many situations feel like emergencies simply because someone else is uncomfortable waiting. How many decisions are framed as now or never when, in truth, they are now or later? Pressure feeds on your cooperation. The moment you stop reacting automatically, it loses its leverage. Not all at once, and not without resistance, but enough that you can finally see it for what it is, a sensation, not a command. This is where most people get confused. They think not trusting their brain under pressure means becoming passive, detached, or cold. But the opposite is true. Reactivity is not engagement, it's reflex. True engagement requires presence, and presence requires space. When you stop letting pressure decide for you, your responses become sharper, not duller. You say fewer words, but they land harder. You make fewer moves, but they matter more. You don't withdraw from the moment. You inhabit it fully. There will be times when this feels lonely, when everyone else is rushing, panicking, demanding answers, and you're the only one standing still, breathing, refusing to be pulled into the storm. In those moments, doubt creeps in. You wonder if you're missing something, if your calm is actually avoidance, if you're being irresponsible by not matching the urgency around you. Pressure is persuasive that way. It shames stillness. It equates speed with care. But calm is not indifference. Calm is discernment. Some of the most destructive decisions in history were made quickly, under pressure, by people convinced they had no time to slow down. And some of the most transformative moments in individual lives came from a pause that felt terrifying at the time. A conversation delayed. A reaction withheld. A choice reconsidered. These moments rarely look dramatic from the outside, but they change everything on the inside. They become the point where someone stopped living on autopilot and started living deliberately. You begin to see how pressure exploits identity. It tells you who you're supposed to be in the moment. Be strong. be decisive, be agreeable, be relentless. And if you hesitate, it whispers that you're failing at that role. But identity under pressure is a costume, not a compass. It's built from expectations and fear, not from truth. When you pause, you give yourself the chance to ask a different question. Not, what should I do right now? But, who do I want to be in this moment? That question changes the quality of your decisions. It shifts the focus from outcome to integrity, from control to alignment. You stop trying to win the moment and start trying to live with it. And strangely enough, that often leads to better outcomes anyway. People trust you more, conflicts de-escalate, opportunities open that wouldn't have if you'd rushed. Not because you were strategic, but because you were grounded. Pressure hates grounded people. It can't rush them as easily. It can't hijack their emotions as cleanly. It can't convince them that everything hinges on a single instant. Grounded people still feel fear, still feel urgency, still feel the pull to act. But they don't confuse those feelings with instructions. They let the feelings exist without letting them drive. That's not suppression, that's mastery. Mastery doesn't look like perfection. You will still mess this up. You will still have moments where pressure wins, where you speak too fast, decide too quickly, react too sharply. The difference is that you'll notice it sooner. You'll recover faster. You won't build a story about who you are based on one pressured moment. You'll treat it as information, not a verdict. And that self-compassion is part of the process. Shame only adds more pressure, and more pressure only deepens the cycle. Over time, you may notice something else shifting. Situations that once overwhelmed you begin to feel manageable, not because they're smaller, but because you're not amplifying them internally. You're not stacking imagined futures on top of present reality. You're dealing with what's actually in front of you, not what your fear predicts. That alone frees up an enormous amount of mental energy. Energy you can use to listen, to think, to choose with intention. This is especially important in moments that involve other people. Pressure turns relationships into battlegrounds. It makes you defend instead of understand. It turns feedback into attack and vulnerability into weakness. When you slow down under pressure, you create room for empathy, not as a moral gesture, but as a practical one. You see that the other person is likely under pressure too, driven by their own fear brain, acting from their own survival patterns. That realization doesn't excuse harm, but it does soften the edges. It allows for responses that heal instead of escalate. Eventually, you begin to trust something deeper than your immediate thoughts. You trust your ability to pause, to breathe, to check in with yourself before acting. That trust is not flashy, but it's unshakable. It doesn't disappear when stakes rise. In fact, that's when it matters most. Because when everything feels urgent, your ability to slow down becomes your greatest advantage. The world will continue to reward speed. It will praise decisiveness and punish hesitation. But the world also quietly suffers from the consequences of rushed thinking. Broken relationships, burned bridges, regretted words, missed nuances. When you choose not to trust your brain under pressure, you are not opting out of life's intensity. You are choosing to meet it with clarity instead of chaos. And one day, without realizing it, you'll find yourself in a moment that once would have overwhelmed you. The pressure will rise, the old sensations will appear, the urge to react will knock loudly. And you'll notice it all happening without being consumed by it. You'll take a breath, maybe two, and you'll respond in a way that feels steady, aligned, and unmistakably your own. Not the version of you hijacked by fear, but the version shaped by awareness. That's when you'll understand the quiet power of not trusting your brain under pressure. Not because your brain is broken, but because you finally learned when to listen and when to wait.